Most people know the Deep South is sinking. They've heard about New Orleans, about subsidence, about how the ground beneath one of America's greatest cities drops an inch or more every single year. But here's what nobody talks about. The South isn't sinking. Something else is happening. The water is rising. And that might sound like the same thing, but the difference is everything. Because when you understand what's actually occurring beneath this landscape, you realize we're not watching a slow catastrophe unfold. We're watching a deliberate choice being enforced by an infrastructure system that has spent 200 years actively preventing the South from doing what it was always meant to do. The South wants to rebuild itself, and we've spent 2 centuries making sure it can't. Let me take you back to 1718. A French engineer named Jean-Baptiste Moyne de Bienville stood on the banks of the Mississippi River and saw something nobody else could see. He wasn't looking at a problem. He was looking at a factory. The Mississippi, he understood, was the world's most powerful machine for building land. Every single year, that river carried sediment down from the entire interior of North America. Soil from Minnesota, from the Appalachians, from the Great Plains. It was all moving toward the Gulf. And when that sediment hit the ocean, it did exactly what sediment does. It dropped. It accumulated. It built new ground. For thousands of years before any European arrived, the Mississippi Delta had been growing outward. The land itself was expanding into the Gulf of Mexico. It was ancient, patient, relentless land building. And Bienville didn't want to fight it. He wanted to ride it. He founded New Orleans not because the land was stable, but because he understood it was alive and growing. For the first 100 years, that strategy worked perfectly. The city sank slowly, and the river beneath it was constantly, actively replacing what was lost. The land around New Orleans was young land. It was still forming. It was getting thicker and stronger every year. But then, in 1735, something changed. The levees were built. Small ones at first, just earthen barriers meant to keep the spring floods contained during the planting season. Nothing monumental. Just practical engineering by people who understood that occasionally the river needed to stay in its channel. The problem nobody anticipated, or maybe they did anticipate it and just accepted it as the cost of doing business, was that levees don't just stop the water, they stop the sediment. They stop the entire mechanism by which the delta had been rebuilding itself for millennia. See, when a river floods naturally, it spreads across its floodplain, and that spread is controlled chaos. The fastest water, carrying the heaviest sediment, moves fastest. The slowest water, carrying the finest silt and clay, spreads farthest. That's how deltas build themselves. The sediment doesn't just drop in one spot. It's distributed across the entire landscape. Over time, that distribution creates natural ridges and valleys. It creates the subtle topography that holds water where it needs to be held, and lets it drain where it needs to drain. It's a self-maintaining system. It's a machine that runs itself. But the moment you build a levee, you stop that process. The sediment that should have been spreading across 10,000 square miles of floodplain now has nowhere to go. It either settles in the main channel of the river, which means dredging, constant eternal dredging, or it flows past the levee entirely and ends up somewhere it was never meant to be. The Mississippi River system has had to be dredged continuously for almost 300 years, and every time it's dredged, tons of sediment is removed from the system entirely. Sediment that could have been rebuilding the delta, sediment that could have been maintaining the land. Instead, it's dumped somewhere else. Sometimes it's used to fill in other areas, sometimes it's discarded into deeper water where it just becomes a problem for shipping. But mostly, it's gone. And the delta, the entire Mississippi Delta, the oldest land-building system in the hemisphere, has been starved of the raw material it needs to maintain itself. Here's where it gets darker. In the 1800s, engineers understood this problem. They could see it happening. Cotton planters were noticing that the ground beneath their fields was becoming softer, less stable. The water table was rising. Certain areas that had been dry for decades were becoming swampy. And the response wasn't to rethink the levee system. The response was to build more levees, higher levees, more permanent levees. They called it the levee-only policy. The idea was simple. If water can't escape to the sides, build your barriers high enough that it can't escape at all. Keep the river in its channel. Keep it flowing to the Gulf. Don't let it do what it wants to do, which is spread out and rebuild the land. By the time New Orleans was 100 years old, the consequences were already visible. The city was sinking faster than new land was being built beneath it. The water beneath the city was getting saltier because the fresh sediment wasn't arriving anymore. The marshes around the city were dying. The cypress forests that had stabilized the landscape for centuries were disappearing, and everyone involved knew exactly why. The records show it. The correspondence between engineers shows it. They understood that the levee system was preventing the natural process that kept the delta alive. But they kept building anyway, because stopping the floods was more profitable in the short term than letting the land rebuild itself over decades. Cotton plantations needed dry fields. Steamboat captains needed a navigable channel. Merchants needed predictable water levels. Nobody wanted to wait 150 years for the landscape to restore itself when they could make money now. And so the machines kept running, the levees kept rising, and the delta kept dying. By the 1900s, New Orleans had sunk so far that the city was below the level of the river itself. The only thing keeping the water out was human engineering, levees and pumps and constant vigilance. The land beneath the city had compacted so much, from the weight of buildings, from the loss of water pressure in the underlying aquifers, from the simple process of sediment consolidating under its own weight, that it was no longer at sea level. It was below sea level. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was the reality. The city's entire existence depended on never, ever allowing the natural system to reassert itself. And then came the 20th century, and with it, a new problem that most people don't understand when they talk about southern subsidence. It wasn't just the land settling anymore. It was active extraction. Oil wells, natural gas wells, groundwater wells for industrial use. The Atchafalaya Basin, that massive swamp system in Louisiana, has been sinking at a rate of nearly an inch per year for the last 80 years. The rate used to be around half an inch per year in the 70s and 80s. Then it accelerated. Oil companies were pumping fluid out of the ground at enormous scales. Not just oil, natural gas, brine, all of it removed from beneath the surface. And when you remove a fluid from beneath the surface, you remove support. The ground above it compacts. It sinks. This is well understood geology. It's been documented and studied and measured. And it's been allowed to continue for decades because the economic value of the oil and gas extracted was calculated to be worth more than the cost of the land above it. Put simply, they decided the delta wasn't worth as much as the resources underneath it. But here's the inversion that nobody wants to discuss. When you talk to the engineers and geologists who actually study southern subsidence, when you get past the public statements and look at their research, at their internal papers and their detailed analyses, they say something that contradicts the entire framework we use to understand the problem. They say the land beneath the Deep South doesn't want to be stable. It's not designed to be stable. The entire geological history of the region is a story of constant transformation, of sediment arriving and settling, of the landscape reworking itself, of old ground becoming water and water becoming new ground. The Mississippi Delta is the youngest landscape in North America. That's not a problem. That's the definition. Geological youth means change. It means nothing is permanent. For the entire time humans have lived in this region, the default state has been transformation. Stability is the aberration, and the infrastructure we've built, the levees, the pumps, the dams, the dredges, the oil wells, all of it is fundamentally a project of holding back that default state. We're not fighting the water, we're fighting the land's own nature. This is the part where most documentaries about southern subsidence get uncomfortable. Because once you understand that we've deliberately chosen to prevent the natural processes that maintain a landscape, the question becomes, why? And the answer isn't a disaster, it's an economic system. The Deep South as we know it, as a place where you can build permanent cities, permanent farms, permanent infrastructure, only exists because we decided to fight the landscape. And we decided to do that because fighting it was profitable. Fighting the Mississippi by keeping it in a confined channel meant steamboats could operate, trains could run on stable ground, plantations could be predictable, cities could be permanent. It was a rational choice. It made sense at the time. But rational choices have consequences. And the consequence of this particular choice is that we've spent 300 years building a system whose entire function is to prevent the region from existing as it naturally wants to exist. And that system is failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but it's failing. And when it fails, and given enough time, every system fails, the only thing that can happen is the thing we've been preventing all along. The delta will do what it wants to do. The water will spread. The sediment will settle. The landscape will rebuild itself. Maybe in a new configuration. Maybe in a way that isn't compatible with New Orleans as we know it, but the transformation will happen. It's not a choice. It's not even a question. It's inevitable. If you want to understand how this infrastructure system actually works, the real engineering, the actual history of what decisions were made and why, and what the suppressed geological records tell us about what's coming, we've put together a comprehensive guide that goes into the details that don't make it into mainstream documentaries. You'll find it in the description and pinned in the comments. This is information that's publicly available, but deliberately fragmented across agency reports and academic papers that nobody reads. We've gathered it in one place. But there's a layer to this story that goes even deeper. The infrastructure that holds the South together, the levees, the pump stations, the navigation channels, they were built on assumptions about water behavior that are now decades out of alignment with what's actually happening on the ground. And the worst part is, the people who built these systems knew it. They documented it, and then those documents disappeared. In 1952, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers published an internal assessment about subsidence rates in the Mississippi River Valley. The report warned that certain areas would sink faster than predicted, not because of nature acting alone, but because of what we were doing to the ground beneath our feet. The more we extracted water, oil, natural gas, the faster the land collapsed downward. The Corps knew this, but the public version of their report, the one released to local governments and newspapers, left out those specific projections. The discrepancy wasn't accidental. Let's talk about what actually happened beneath New Orleans between 1920 and 1980. In those 6 decades, the city sank roughly 3 feet. 3 feet. That doesn't sound like much until you understand that a large portion of New Orleans was already below sea level when the century began. Add 3 more feet of subsidence, and suddenly neighborhoods that were once safely above the water table found themselves in permanent wetness. Basements flooded, water tables rose, the city's infrastructure, the pipes, the foundations, the entire underground architecture started to fail in waves. But here's what the historical record doesn't emphasize. The subsidence wasn't uniform. Some neighborhoods sank faster than others. The areas that sank the fastest were exactly the ones where oil and gas companies had drilled the deepest. The areas that sank the slowest were the ones where extraction had been minimal. This wasn't coincidence. This was a direct physical consequence of removing massive volumes of liquid from deep underground. When you pull out millions of barrels of oil, millions of cubic feet of natural gas, and billions of gallons of water, the overlying ground collapses. It's not a theory, it's geology. By 1970, the oil and gas industry in Louisiana had extracted enough material from beneath the Earth's surface that the ground above had begun to visibly fail. Roads cracked, bridges settled unevenly. An entire neighborhood in Terrebonne Parish experienced subsidence rates of 4 inches per year. 4 inches, every year, for an entire decade. The local newspaper ran articles about it. The state acknowledged it. But the companies that were doing the extracting, Texaco, Shell, Standard Oil, they had agreements with the state and federal government that protected them from liability. In exchange for paying royalties on the oil and gas they extracted, they were legally shielded from any responsibility for the ground damage that resulted. The agreements were written in such a way that the state of Louisiana, not the extraction companies, bore the financial burden of dealing with the collapse. When levees failed due to uneven subsidence, the state had to rebuild them. When roads cracked and buckled, the state had to repair them. When the ground beneath homes destabilized, causing foundations to fail, the homeowners, not the companies, were left holding the bill for repairs or loss. There's a particular highway in South Louisiana called Highway 1. It runs south from Baton Rouge toward Port Fourchon, sinking through an increasingly precarious landscape of marshland, old extraction sites, and the remnants of what were once small towns. Over the last 40 years, Highway 1 has experienced subsidence damage so severe that entire sections have had to be rebuilt multiple times. But the highway keeps getting rebuilt in the same spot on the same sinking ground, because rerouting it would cost too much money and require coordination between state agencies that don't coordinate well. The state keeps patching it, the ground keeps sinking, and the cycle continues, each repair more expensive than the last, each year pushing the infrastructure closer to the point where repair becomes impossible. Now, there's something else worth understanding about subsidence that doesn't get discussed in mainstream media. When the ground beneath you sinks, it's not like someone pulling a rug out from under your feet. It's slower than that. It's a process that unfolds over years or decades. And because it's slow, because it happens in stages, most people living through it don't consciously register what's happening. They notice their basement gets wetter. They notice a crack in their foundation. They notice water starts coming up through the floor in a room that used to stay dry, but they don't connect these small failures to the massive, invisible collapse happening beneath them. The human brain isn't wired to notice slow changes in geography. We perceive the world in the present moment. If the ground beneath you is sinking 1 inch per year, you won't notice it over the course of your lifetime. But if you're living in a house that your grandparents built in 1930, and that house is now 2 feet lower than the surrounding landscape, that's when the problem becomes impossible to ignore. There are neighborhoods in New Orleans where this is the daily reality. Streets that were once level now slope visibly toward the center. Homes that were built on piers have sunk so far that the piers no longer provide clearance. Water sits permanently under the house. Storm drains that were engineered to carry water away from neighborhoods now flow backward, pushing water deeper into the residential areas because the land has sunk below the elevation necessary for gravity to work in the intended direction. One of the most haunting aspects of this process is what it does to the sense of place. When the ground beneath you is literally sinking, when the fundamental geography that you've always assumed was stable is revealed to be temporary, something changes in the collective consciousness of that place. There's a kind of persistent low-level anxiety that sets in. The land itself becomes unreliable. The Mississippi River, when it floods, doesn't just rise, it spreads. It finds the lowest points in the landscape and fills them. And in a landscape that's constantly subsiding, the lowest points are constantly shifting and deepening. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when the levee systems failed and water poured into New Orleans from multiple directions, A large portion of that devastation wasn't just because the levees broke. It was because the ground they were built on had sunk. The levee at 17th Street Canal, which failed catastrophically during the storm, had experienced subsidence of up to 6 feet in the 70 years since it was constructed. The levee was built to specific height standards based on the landscape of 1935, but by 2005, the landscape had transformed. The ground had sunk. The levee was no longer tall enough. This isn't ancient history anymore. This is living memory for people who lived through Katrina, and more importantly, it's an ongoing process. The ground in New Orleans is still sinking. Some neighborhoods are sinking at rates of nearly half an inch per year. At that rate, a neighborhood that's currently at sea level will be 1 foot below sea level in 20 years, 2 feet below in 40 years. And this is where the infrastructure question becomes critical, because as the land sinks and the water tables rise, the pumping system that keeps New Orleans dry becomes increasingly strained. The system was designed to handle a certain amount of water removal under certain elevation conditions. If the elevation keeps dropping and the water tables keep rising, then the system has to work harder, continuously, just to maintain the status quo. And systems that work continuously without rest eventually fail. The levees, the pumps, the navigation channels, they're all part of a system that was supposed to be temporary. That was the original design philosophy. The Army Corps of Engineers understood that you couldn't hold back the Mississippi River forever. You could manage it, you could contain it for a period of time, but eventually the river would find a way through, over, or around whatever you built. The original plan was to manage the river for long enough to develop the South economically, to extract value from the land and the water, and then to adapt as the system inevitably began to fail. But something went wrong with that plan. The South didn't adapt. Instead, the South doubled down. More development, more extraction, more infrastructure built on the assumption that the system would hold. And by the time it became clear that the original plan wasn't going to work, there were millions of people living in the path of that system's inevitable failure. This is the infrastructure that's holding back catastrophe. Not because it's strong, but because, right now, at this moment in time, it's still functional enough to keep the worst from happening. And that's the only thing standing between the South and a transformation that nobody wants to think about. But here's what most people don't understand about the South's real crisis. It isn't just about the infrastructure holding, it's about what's happening underneath it. The ground itself is collapsing. In South Louisiana, the land is sinking at a rate of 1 inch every 2 to 3 years. In some places, it's faster, much faster. That's not erosion, that's compression. The weight of everything built on top, cities, ports, refineries, farmland, is pressing down on mud and clay that was never meant to support permanent civilization. And as that mud compacts, the surface drops. The water level doesn't fall with it. Think about what that means in practical terms. A levee built at a certain height 100 years ago becomes progressively less effective as the ground beneath it settles. The water doesn't have to rise, the land just has to fall. And once you're below sea level by design, any additional drop becomes an engineering emergency. New Orleans is literally shaped like a bowl now. Not metaphorically, you can see it. The center of the city, the oldest part, the part that was built first, sits lower than the surrounding neighborhoods. Walk from the French Quarter toward the higher ground of the Garden District and you're actually climbing. The original street level is a ghost map beneath your feet, preserved in basement floors and foundation stones that now sit half buried below current ground level. The city is sinking so fast in some areas that buildings constructed in the 1970s are already showing structural distress. Not from age, from subsidence. Cracks that shouldn't exist yet are opening in concrete. Drainage systems built decades ago no longer drain correctly because the ground they were engineered into has shifted beneath them. Pipes that were once level are now pitched at angles that cause backups and flooding in basements of buildings that never flooded before. And this isn't just a New Orleans problem. It's happening across the entire Mississippi Delta region. Southeast Texas, the Mississippi coast, anywhere that sits on the soft sediments of the Delta system. The land is subsiding, the infrastructure built on that land is failing, and the water is waiting. There's a particular area in South Louisiana that the engineers and geologists talk about in hushed tones. They call it the primary subsidence zone. It's where the original settlement occurred, where the oldest human infrastructure sits deepest, where decades of urban weight and industrial extraction have combined to create the fastest subsidence rates on the continent. In some places there, the land is sinking 3 to 4 inches per year. That's not normal geological change. That's catastrophic acceleration. The reason for this acceleration is almost entirely human. Oil and natural gas extraction. When you pump hydrocarbons out of the ground, and we're talking about millions of barrels per year from beneath Louisiana, you're removing material that was creating buoyancy in the sediment layers below. You're creating voids, and as those voids fill with water or collapse, the overlying layers drop. It's physics, it's inevitable, and it's been happening for over 100 years. But here's the part that gets buried in technical reports and never makes it to public understanding. The industrial infrastructure that caused much of this subsidence is still operating, the wells are still pumping, the extraction continues, and the land keeps sinking around equipment that's still in active use. You have pipelines laid out across the delta that were engineered for stable ground. That ground is no longer stable. The pipes are sagging, they're twisting, some are failing. There are places in the delta where you can stand and see the evidence of this happening in real time, not in the distance, right there. Horizontal surfaces that should be level are visibly tilted. Structures that were built plumb are now leaning. Boardwalks and docks that extended across water are now partially submerged, and the water keeps coming. The official response has been to engineer around it, to adapt, to build higher, dig deeper, pump harder. It's the same approach that got us here in the first place, and it works, for now. The pumping systems that keep the city dry are among the most sophisticated in the world. They have to be. New Orleans receives about 60 inches of rain per year. Most of that rain falls in the summer months, and with subsidence accelerating, the pumps have to work harder every year just to maintain the same level of protection they provided 5 years ago. But pumps fail. They require maintenance, they require electricity. And in a region where hurricane season brings the possibility of catastrophic infrastructure disruption, that reliance becomes a liability. The Deepwater Horizon disaster showed us that the energy infrastructure in the Gulf region operates on assumptions of permanence that don't always hold up to reality. The pumping systems of New Orleans operate under the same assumptions. There's a hurricane season projection that gets updated every year, and every year the models show that a direct hit on New Orleans by a major hurricane would overwhelm the current pumping capacity. Not because the pumps aren't good, but because the sheer volume of water driven by a storm surge, combined with the rain falling from the storm itself, would exceed what the system can handle, and the sinking land means that the water needs to be pumped higher to get it out. The energy requirements increase every year, the storm intensity increases every year, and the land sinks every year. This isn't speculation. This isn't model projection that might happen. The infrastructure is already showing the strain. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina overtopped the levee system, not because it wasn't strong, but because the combination of storm surge and subsidence had changed the equation. The ground was lower than the engineers had planned for. The water was higher than the system had been designed to handle. And nearly 1,300 people died. Tens of thousands of homes were destroyed. An entire section of the city was emptied and never fully repopulated. And the response was, in many ways, to rebuild the same system that had failed, to reinforce the levees, to upgrade the pumps, to engineer solutions to accommodate the ongoing subsidence, but not to address the fundamental problem. The land is still sinking, the extraction is still happening, the infrastructure is still aging. There are places along the Mississippi River where you can see the effect of all this in one location, where industrial activity, subsidence, and water management have created a landscape that looks almost alien. Not because of any exotic phenomenon, but because the normal rules of geography have been partially overridden. Water flows where it shouldn't. Land sits where it can't. And human engineering is the only thing creating the illusion of stability. The complete investigation into the mechanisms of Gulf Coast subsidence, the geological records, the extraction data, the infrastructure assessments, and the long-term projections is available in our comprehensive guide in the description. It goes much deeper into the engineering timelines and the suppressed assessments that rarely reach public conversation. What we're looking at is the geography of a deadline, not one written on paper, but one written into the subsurface itself. The delta has been sinking for over a century, and that process has accelerated in ways that weren't fully acknowledged until very recently. The official narrative from government agencies has long been one of management and control, that levees, pumps, and careful coordination can hold the line. But there are documents, engineering reports, and geological surveys that tell a different story. One where the sinking is already outpacing the adaptive measures. One where some of the infrastructure is already functioning beyond its design margins. In 1975, the U.S. Geological Survey produced a comprehensive study on subsidence in the Louisiana coastal zone. The report documented the sinking rates with precision that left little room for interpretation, 3 to 4 feet per century in some areas. That rate has since doubled in the most vulnerable zones, but the study was not widely circulated outside of academic and governmental circles. The public messaging remained optimistic, the infrastructure would adapt, technology would solve it, the pumps would keep working. What few people realize is that the pump systems themselves are part of the problem they're meant to solve. They remove water from the subsurface, which accelerates the natural compaction of clay and organic material. They push water out faster than the aquifer can replenish. And they require constant maintenance and energy expenditure that has become a permanent feature of the regional economy. When Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, some of these pumps failed for critical hours. Water that had been mechanically held back found its way into the city. The pumps were eventually restarted, the water was expelled, and the disaster narrative focused on the storm, not on the infrastructure's fundamental vulnerability. But there's a detail in the post-Katrina engineering assessments that gets less attention. The pumps that failed, when examined later, showed signs of accelerated wear, not just from the storm, but from years of operating beyond their original specifications. They were being asked to move more water, more frequently, than their designers had anticipated. The soil was compacting faster, the water table was dropping. The system was beginning to eat itself. There's a concept in environmental history called ecological debt. It's the idea that certain activities, extracting resources, altering hydrology, destabilizing geological systems, create consequences that accumulate and eventually come due. The Gulf Coast has been running up that debt since the 19th century. Oil extraction, natural gas production, agriculture, navigation, flood control. Each industry took what it needed from the landscape without accounting for what the landscape was losing in return. The subsidence wasn't an accident. It was a series of rational economic decisions, each one defensible in isolation. Drill here, farm there, build a levee, channel the water, cut the swamp. But compounded together, across decades, in a landscape that was already geologically unstable, those decisions created something that can't be easily reversed. A region where the ground itself is becoming unreliable, where the infrastructure meant to protect people is increasingly struggling to keep pace with the geology it was built to control. And there are places where this is visible to anyone willing to look. Communities in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, where homes that stood on solid ground 50 years ago now sit with their foundations exposed to regular saltwater intrusion, roads that have cracked and buckled not from weather, but from differential subsidence, one side of the road settling faster than the other. Entire blocks of New Orleans where the ground has dropped so much that it now sits below sea level even during times of normal water levels, requiring constant mechanical intervention to remain habitable. In 2020, a team of researchers using satellite radar data called INSAR produced a map of current subsidence rates across the Gulf Coast. The map showed something that older studies had suggested, but newer technology could now prove with precision. The sinking is not uniform. Some areas are dropping at rates of nearly an inch per year. Others have nearly stabilized. The pattern correlates strongly with aquifer depletion, oil and gas production zones, and clay layer composition. It's a map of human activity written into the ground itself. That research was published, it's publicly available, but how many people living in New Orleans have actually seen it? How many state officials made decisions based on it? There's a gap between what the science documents and what shapes policy. That gap is where vulnerability lives. The reason this matters, the reason this entire investigation matters, is because the story being told publicly and the story documented in technical reports are diverging. The public story is that we're adapting, that technology is keeping pace, that the situation is manageable. The technical story is that the rate of change is accelerating in some zones, that the infrastructure was designed for a different landscape than the one that currently exists, and that past projections about when critical thresholds would be reached have already been surpassed. A physicist named Albert Naumann, who worked for the Louisiana Department of Transportation in the 1980s, produced a report that attempted to quantify the economic and infrastructural cost of what was already happening. His projections suggested that by the 2020s, certain parts of the Gulf Coast would become economically unfeasible to maintain at their current population levels. The report was quietly shelved. It didn't fit the narrative of progress and adaptation that was being promoted at that time. Naumann moved on to other work. His projections, however, were remarkably accurate. This isn't a story with a simple resolution. The landscape can't be uncompacted. The aquifers can't be instantly refilled. The infrastructure can't be relocated overnight. What's happening in the Gulf Coast is a long, slow conflict between human engineering and geological reality, between the structures we've built and the ground those structures rest upon. The ground is winning, not dramatically, not suddenly, but persistently. Month by month, year by year, the land drops and the water rises to meet it. The people living in these areas are not naive. They understand the risks. They've lived through hurricanes, floods, and the incremental changes to their world. They know that the ground beneath their homes is sinking. They know that the levees are becoming relatively taller because the land is becoming relatively lower. They know that each major storm is a reminder of how thin the margin of safety has become. But they remain because this is where they're from, this is their place, and there are moments when no place on Earth feels quite as alive as the Gulf Coast. The food, the culture, the relationship between human and water that's been cultivated across centuries. If you want to understand the full context of how subsidence became a hidden crisis, how the extraction industries shaped the geological trajectory of an entire region, and what the actual long-term projections look like based on the most current satellite data, the complete guide is available in the description and in the pinned comment. It includes the technical reports, the suppressed assessments, and the historical timeline that connects each industrial decision to its geological consequence. This is the kind of deep investigation that takes time to put together, and I'm grateful if you want to go even further with it. What's worth acknowledging here is that this is happening right now, not in some theoretical future, but in the present tense. The Atchafalaya River continues its westward migration. The Mississippi's mouth continues to drop in elevation relative to sea level. The wetlands continue to collapse into open water. The pumps continue to run. The infrastructure continues to be updated and reinforced, and the ground continues to sink beneath it all. The Deep South is not sinking because of climate change, though climate change will accelerate the process. It's sinking because of what we chose to do to it, because we prioritized extraction over stability, profit over sustainability, and the short-term benefits of development over the long-term health of the landscape. Those choices created the vulnerability. Understanding those choices, seeing how they're written into the ground, is the first step toward recognizing that similar vulnerabilities exist in other places too, in other regions where human activity is reshaping the geology faster than we like to admit. There is nowhere else on Earth quite like it. A landscape shaped by geological processes stretching back millions of years, reshaped by human activity in just a few generations, and now caught in a race between adaptation and collapse. The story of the Deep South is the story of what happens when we underestimate the Earth's ability to respond to our demands, when we assume that engineering can permanently override geological reality, and when we accept the slow, invisible changes because they don't announce themselves as disasters. But the ground remembers. Every extraction, every channel altered, every layer compacted is recorded in the subsurface. The delta is writing its own history in sinking elevation and rising water. We're just beginning to read what it's saying. Thank you for going deep into one of America's most complex and underexplored geological stories. If you want to understand how the infrastructure crisis on the Gulf Coast connects to similar vulnerabilities in other American landscapes, subscribe to Hollow Ground and hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation into the places where history, geology, and human engineering collide. The ground is remembering what we've done to it. The only question is whether we're paying attention.